This is Right from the Deep.
I'm Karen Ball.
And I'm Erin Taylor Young. And this is the podcast from writers for writers, answering the question,
why am I doing this?
As writers, editors,
and a former literary agent,
we're in the deep with you,
bringing interviews, inspiration, and information to encourage, refresh, and equip you to embrace the deep, to find your truest story, your truest message in the deep places.
You can get the episode show notes, lots more information and encouragement, and your free audio download, 5 crucial ways to safeguard your writer's heart at rightfromthedeep.com. Welcome, friends and fellow travelers in the deep. We're so glad that you're here with us. We're excited to share part 2 of our Superficiality podcast. Last week, we talked about how we need to stop settling for a superficial life. If you haven't heard that episode, I do encourage you to go and listen. We live in a superficial world, and our brains, even our brains, are getting rewired for superficiality rather than depth of thought. And we keep getting drawn more and more into superficial online relationships. And this is a perfect setup for superficial writing. Because as Karen so wisely said last week, she said, there's no way to write well when you don't even know who you are.
Who you are, or the struggles and questions that you have, or when you're not willing to be vulnerable. So what's the problem with superficial writing? Well, primarily, when you write from a superficial standpoint, you just skim the surface of, in nonfiction, the topic, or in fiction, the story that God has given you to tell. And when you write on that superficial, skimming the surface level, readers can tell. They can tell you're not invested. They can tell you're not engaged. And as a result, they're not engaged. And guys, I can tell as an editor, or when I was acquiring manuscripts for publishers, I could tell that someone wasn't really cutting the vein and bleeding on the page, that it was just them talking from the head and not from the heart. And you know why that's so bad? Because that kind of writing doesn't engage, and it doesn't do anything to illuminate or to change or to move people. So superficial writing will do nothing beyond creating small ripples in readers' minds and hearts, and it may not even do that.
So yeah, this podcast is about writing from the deep. We're called Right from the Deep. That's the name of the show. So let's review, what is writing from the deep? And in part, yes, it's about our character, who we are as people, and being steeped in God, and doing all of those things as we navigate the publishing industry, because, oh boy, aren't there a lot of trials and difficulties and uncertainties and joy too. There's all good in there too, but our character needs to be steeped in God deeply as we navigate the publishing industry.
We need to be operating out of obedience as well, following what God has told us to do in obedience, laying our career and the things that we're writing and who we are personally and in relationships at His feet, and asking Him to help us to dig deeper, to understand who we are.
And writing from the deep is also about how we create with God. And let me just say, I have a little pet peeve here. It's not for God. We are not doing things for God, because He doesn't need us to do things for Him. Acts 17:24 and 25 says, "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And He is not served by human hands, as if He needed anything. Rather, He Himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else." And He lets us participate with Him, you guys. He lets us create with Him. We imitate Him when we love people and when we create and do the things that our God does. So here we are creating with God. That's part of writing from the deep.
The other part about being steeped in obedience to God is that we don't worry about our career. We don't look at it and stress if we're not getting the readers we think we should be getting, or if we're not reaching that readership that we think we should be getting. All of that is submitted to God. God will bring the right people to us and to our books, fiction, nonfiction, devotional. It doesn't matter. God will bring the people who need to hear the message that He's given you to share. And so we can't get all tied up about about numbers. We can't get all tied up about market share and market reach. We just need to be obedient about digging deep into our own faith journeys and digging deep into our own understanding and our own struggles and wrestling with God so that we can let that come out on the page in a vulnerable way. And that's the second part about this whole two-part podcast is writing from the deep, making sure that we're digging deep into topics, into the themes, that we choose to write about things that matter to us, not because we think that the readership or the market is going to like it, but because it's something that burns inside of us and we can't walk away from writing about it. And it's about writing in such a way that we hit an emotional core, first within ourselves as we think and pray about this, and then in the stories and in the characters. When you go deep in your writing, when you dig the depths of your own emotions, your own journeys, your own experiences, that's the kind of writing that changes lives.
So let's talk about practically, how do we do this? How do we dig deep in our writing? And it starts again with not being superficial ourselves. And we talked about all that in the last episode, laying that foundation for dropping the masks and scheduling time for thinking deeply and creating with God and having deeper relationships. So the thing is, if we're not avoiding superficiality in life, we can't avoid it in our writing.
Right.
But I found a great quote, and this was in a blog post that Bob Hostetler wrote for the Steve Lobby Agency. And it was a quote by Rachel Hauck. She's a USA Today bestselling author, New York Times bestselling author. And the the blog post was about writing advice, but I thought this bit here was really applicable to writing from the deep. Rachel says this: I say, write who you are. You can never stop mining the depths of your heart, what you love and believe, your values and passions. I discover something new about myself with each book when I write who I am.
So how does that translate into what we put on the page? Well, when you mine those kinds of depths, and when you even go beyond that and mine the depths of your struggles as well, your deepest wrestling with God, you find that the things that you write about are more authentic. I don't know how many of you have either read the book, The Case for Christ, or watched the new movie that came out not too long ago, but I was astounded when I watched the movie that Lee Strobel was so willing to be honest and open, vulnerable about who he was before he met Christ. Folks, if you've watched that movie, he was pretty much a jerk. And it wasn't out of being willful. It was because he was so shaken by his wife coming to faith in Christ, and his wife seemingly, putting someone before him in her relationships and in her love. And he wanted to do everything he could to discount the faith, and he just got borderline ridiculous in the levels he was going to. But he also showed the reality of who he was in his relationships and all that kind of thing. It wasn't just discovering the truth about himself. It was his willingness to be vulnerable. A lot of people would say, oh, I don't want anybody to see how I was then. I don't want anybody to see me scaring my little girl because I'm coming home angry. But he just let it all go out there because it was in showing who he was, and then the change when he finally did come face to face with God and with Christ and surrender. So much so that I find myself recommending this movie to everybody that I talk to, because that kind of openness on the part of a writer is what we need to do, not just in our real life events and interactions, but in our stories. Fiction, nonfiction, it doesn't matter. We have got to be honest, and we've got to lay everything out.
So mining the depths of who you are and what you believe happens by asking those hard questions, like Rachel was talking about, who you are, and being willing to be open. And it comes with wrestling with God for the answers and writing about what you discover through it. We've got to be willing to ask those questions. And I confess, this is hard for me sometimes because it's work. This kind of questioning is hard work, digging through and being willing to be open with what you find.
It's when we go deep into those questions and when we surrender them before God and we ask Him to lead us and guide us to answers. It's that whole journey, that process that ends up exposing universal truths. And those are the kinds of truths that will touch readers because those truths apply to them as well. Francine Rivers said once that when she approaches a new book, she does so out of her own struggle to answer questions. When she wrote Voice in the Wind, she was struggling with the question of how do I stand for my faith in a world that's hostile to Christ? And it's not like she had all the answers already. It was in the course of the research and the writing that she was finding the answers. And so that story unfolded in an authentic way. Those characters unfolded in an authentic way because it came out of her own struggles. If you're writing nonfiction, this kind of wrestling over questions is vital. I mean, people are asking those hard questions. Where was God when I lost my child to a drunk driver?
Yeah.
Why is my spouse a serial adulterer? How do I pick up the pieces after a fire sweeps away my house, like is happening right now as we're recording this in Northern California? And that big question, is God even there? How many of you can admit that you've asked that question, that you've thought to yourself, or you said to God, are you real? Guys, I confess that I have at times, not necessarily because I'm doubting Him, but because there's this flash of concern that I've given myself over to something that's a scam. And that's the human mind trying to work through it. And it's in working through those things that we find truths that are going to help the other people who are dealing with these same questions. We have to give them solid, vulnerable, honest, raw answers to these questions. You can't give them cliches and pat answers. That's just not going to cut it.
And it's just as important, if you're not talking about something tragic, maybe, people have all kinds of needs and challenges. It's just as important to go deep. You might be writing about what it means to be a follower of Christ in a superficial world, or maybe in an agnostic world. You might be writing a Bible study or writing about evangelism or whatever. You might be writing humor, but the bottom line is still the same. Is there a point? Is there a takeaway people can sink their teeth into? Or is it just transient? Is it forgettable?
Another way that we dig deep into our writing is to mine the depths of emotions on the page. Get to the core. Writing with depth doesn't shy away from these emotions. You're not afraid to get those emotions down on a page. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not talking about graphic writing. I'm talking about being vulnerable and honest with your characters, with your illustrations, with the things that you put on the page. You need to go there so that your readers can go there with you and be as vulnerable and honest as they read through. Just a little caution here. Be careful that you pace those deep, raw places so that your readers don't end up feeling emotionally drained or exhausted at the end of the book, even halfway through, and they can't read anymore.
And we talked about in the last episode not being afraid to dig into our own pain or the pain of others. And obviously the same now is true of the writing, because these readers of fiction and nonfiction, they want to feel and experience, but realize not just the grief, okay, not just the despair, but they want to feel the triumph as well. They want to feel the joy of falling in love, or the triumph over, whatever evil archenemy there is, or illness, or whatever. Your reader wants to be there. They want to share in that emotion. And you can't do that unless you're willing to go there yourself and you're willing to write with an authenticity that comes from what you've experienced.
So what are some practical tips for doing this, for putting emotions on the page? Well, you're the first measuring stick, folks, as you're writing. If you're not feeling it, your reader won't either. I mean, teachers have talked about that for years and years at writers' conferences. If you're writing an emotionally charged scene, but it's not affecting you, you're holding back. You're skimming the surface. But there's a special caution for the nonfiction writers out there. Don't let yourself write from a teacher perspective where you're kind of above it all and you hold yourself back from the emotions so that you can just talk about the facts and give a lesson. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm just saying that I've read a lot of manuscripts where people are talking about these issues and it's evident that they're not really invested and engaged in them. And that's not going to change anybody's life.
In fiction, this is one area where it's important to show rather than tell. Don't tell us your character is angry. Don't name emotions. We want a picture. Paint that picture. Show the emotion. Show how it impacts everybody. Show how it impacts your relationships. Show what's happening emotionally.
One of the ways to accomplish this is to pay attention in your own life to your relationships and your encounters, your interactions with people, even standing in the line at Starbucks or at the bank. You can find out so much about a person in the way that they are in social interactions with people they don't know. With your spouse, think about it. What are those subtle little things, those elements that you two share together that nobody else knows what they mean, but they mean so much to you? Think about your friends. What is it about your friends that connects and resonates with you? Is it the sound of their voice, the smile when they see you? What are those little details of friendship that draw out of you the desire to be in relationship with them, to be friends with them, to care about them? You need to take a hard look, a deep look at those real life situations, even if it means going someplace and studying people and their interactions, like the mall or the airport or any place where there are a lot of people together. Study the subtleties between them, the little touch of the hand on a shoulder, the stiff lips showing that there's some kind of tension going on, the somebody reaching out to touch an arm and the arm being withdrawn. Draw on all of that. Use it to flesh out the emotions and relationships on the page. One specific example of this for fiction is with romance novels. You know how it just doesn't ring true when you have the hero and the heroine looking at each other and thinking, oh, she's gorgeous, or wow, he's so handsome. And then suddenly they're in love. And you're sitting there thinking, seriously? What are they, teenagers? This has to be something that goes far beyond just the physical attributes. Show what it is in a person that will draw your character. What is it that appeals to them? Is it the other person's behavior, their laugh, the way they are with children or animals or the elderly? All those kinds of things that resonate with your character, that resonate with us in the real world. You've got to find those things and let it come out on the page so that your characters and their relationships are as multifaceted as they are in real life. And with nonfiction, if you realize you're skimming the surface of how a topic or an issue affects you, then please do us all a favor and dig deeper. Make a list of interactions or events, those keystones that not only made you aware of the topic, but spurred you to write about it. Why are you writing about it? Why does this matter? And it has to be more than just, I think there's an audience for this. It has to be something that has impacted you, something that you care about. Let your readers know your own struggle and your heart.
So in fiction, another way to write from the deep is to let your characters either be or become deep, not superficial. And again, this means taking what we should be doing in real life, fostering deep relationships, and putting it into practice in our writing. We had a great comment on our last podcast. Someone said, if we don't take the time to get to know people around us, how can we expect to get to know our characters well enough to tell a story? Bravo. That is a great insight. If you don't know your characters, you know what you're going to get? Stereotypes. I know, it's like the curse.
Run from the room.
Yeah, you can avoid stereotypes simply by knowing more than just the basics about your characters. Think of them like jewels. Like they have all these different facets. These characters need to shine differently depending on which light they're in or what side you're looking at or who they're talking to. They might act differently. They probably do around their mom than around their boss or around their child. So you've got different aspects that you can explore of their personality. You need to know them and explore them and understand who that person is.
Another way to avoid stereotypes is to have your characters do or think or feel the unexpected. Okay, so let's say your villain is a serial killer, but what if he's also a guy who just absolutely loves kittens? And the way he chooses his victims is that he sees someone being cruel to animals, and so they have to die. Or what if you've got a hero who can't stand kids? Everything about him seems wonderful, but he has no connection with children. And then the heroine finds out that it's because he lost a younger sibling, and he thinks it's his fault, and he's afraid to let himself care. Something like that. Guys, you can smash stereotypes by letting your characters have unexpected elements to them. Also, how can you know your characters as well as you know your best friend? I have one tool to recommend for you in this. I make a drink for my characters. Most of the time, I think that I'm going to be making them coffee because that's my drink of choice. I'm a true coffee fan. I have all kinds of devices. And so I think about which way would they like it, as a pour-over, as a French press, as a Keurig. What are they looking for? But I'm always surprised by my characters when one of them will look at me and say, no, I'd really prefer tea.
Oh, no.
Yeah. I'm like, okay, I got to figure this sucker out. Nonfiction writers, you can do something similar to that with your target reader in mind, because you need to know and understand them as well as we in fiction need to know and understand our characters.
And just another quick word here about characters. Karen and I do have a character book that we are working on. So that's going to come out one day, probably in a few months when we get all our books together there. But we want you to know that it's coming. We'll put a link in someday when it's done in a couple months. So, okay, let's move on. Just as the emotion and truths and characters in your books need to be deep, so does the conflict. You cannot have the driving force be some misunderstanding that can be cleared up over a cup of Karen's coffee. I have seen that, believe me, and it's very frustrating. If you don't want to torture your characters, you need to get over that, okay?
Right.
Because the harder and the deeper and the more painful that journey is for your characters, guess what? The more heroic they are when they conquer. And we want heroic heroes.
So, practical tips again. Writing teacher and agent Donald Moss, I think, says it really well. Basically, he tells writers to make things bad for the characters, then make them worse, and then make them even worse. Yeah. So it's a building situation. You build on the conflict. You start at one level, and then it increases, or it deepens as the story advances. Reveal the conflict in its different stages and levels with the story. Be strategic in how you unpack it so the reader will understand it, get new elements of understanding, and that helps them to connect with the character and care about them.
And something else, require sacrifice of your characters, because the conflict is nothing if it doesn't cost something. Make it cost dearly to your character, because otherwise, who cares? So think about that. Know your character well enough to know what hits your character right where they live, and put them in the position of having to make really hard choices, and don't give them a good option. Make them have to give up things or people that they care about.
Nonfiction writers, you can use all of these things as well. You can use them when you write your strategic examples, illustrations, anecdotes to draw emotion from your readers. Use stories of those you know or those who've shared their stories with you to be used in this book. Write them using these fiction tools so that they can be effective and impactful. So obviously, what we've shared with you in this podcast today is just scratching the surface of writing in a deeper place. Now, I just want to say that's not because we're being superficial, but it's because this podcast would be hours long if we explored yes. all the elements of it. What we really wanted to do in these last two podcasts is just to get you pointed in the right direction, to nudge you, to go deeper, to ensure that your writing doesn't just skim over the surface of the story or the message or the emotions. Please don't ever settle for that kind of writing. When you do that, it's a disservice not just to your readers, but the one who gave you your message. Dig deep. Be vulnerable. Write from who you are and the real-life joys, delights, struggles, trials, everything that you face. Remember that old saying, nothing is wasted in a writer's life. It's all fodder for going deeper in your writing. Friends, all you have to do is be willing to open up, because that's the kind of writing that God can utilize, not only to help and change your readers, but to help and change you.
Amen.
Amen. Thanks for listening today. We hope you found it helpful.
You might also like the backlist episodes, which you can find along with a free audio download, 5 Crucial Ways to Safeguard Your Writer's Heart, at our website, writefromthedeep.com.
If you'd like to support the show, and we would love it if you'd do that, you can contribute through the website.
To connect with us, go to the website or tweet us at KarenBall1, that's the number 1, or Erin T. Young.
So until next time,
embrace the deep.
Your writing and your life will never be the same.
Amen.
Amen.